Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being truly well-informed. Today we're diving into a topic that feels, well, incredibly timely, especially given the last few years. We're talking about the huge shift to online learning in healthcare education, and specifically the rise of virtual patients.
Yeah, it's a really interesting area.
And our mission today, it goes beyond just asking, were students satisfied? We want to really explore how physician assistant students, PA students, actually experience these virtual patient simulations, what really influenced their learning, their engagement, and crucially, how authentic did it all feel? It's about getting past the surface level.
Exactly. And it's critical because these virtual patients, they aren't just a temporary fix from the pandemic, right? They're fundamentally changing how we train healthcare professionals. So the big question is, how effective are they really? Are they preparing our future PAs and other clinicians properly? We're looking at a new qualitative study today that really gets into the actual experiences of these PA learners. It gives us a much richer picture than, simple surveys can. It's a deep dive into what's working and maybe what isn't.
Okay, so let's back up a step. Virtual patients, VPs. What exactly are we talking about here?
All right, so think of them as interactive computer simulations, basically digital versions of real-life clinical scenarios.
Okay, and they were gaining ground even before COVID, you said.
Oh, yeah, definitely. For some pretty practical reasons. Finding enough quality in-person clinical spots can be tough. And VPs offer this safe space. Students can practice, make mistakes even, without any risk to actual patients. It's a kind of training ground.
A risk-free zone. Makes sense.
And then, boom, the pandemic hit, and that just put everything into hyperdrive. Suddenly, those in-person placements, gone or severely limited. So VPs became, well, essential, a really crucial supplement almost overnight.
Right, a necessity.
But here's the thing, the researchers noticed the gap in the research. Lots of studies looked at, like satisfaction scores. Did students like the VPs? But very few dug into how they perceived them, how they engaged, especially around this idea of authenticity.
Authenticity. Okay, what did they mean by that in the study?
They broke it down into two types, which is helpful. First, there's physical authenticity. That's the look and feel. Realistic 3D characters. Does the wound look right? The sounds, that kind of stuff.
Gotcha, the visuals.
Yeah. Then there's psychological authenticity. And this seems to be the more critical one. It's about how realistic the interaction feels. Does it mirror how you'd actually talk to a patient, how a case unfolds? And past research suggests that when this psychological authenticity is high, the learning outcomes are generally better.
That's a really key difference. So maybe focusing too much on making it look perfect isn't the main thing if the conversation feels fake.
That's exactly the tension the study explores. But first, just quickly, the study itself, it was qualitative. They did in-depth interviews and focus groups with 11 PA students from 2 different Canadian programs. And the specific platform they were using was called iHuman Patients.
Okay, iHuman. And the core question they were trying to answer.
Pretty straightforward. What factors influence PA students' experiences of and engagement with virtual patient education? What makes it work or not work for them?
So diving into those experiences, what did the students say? Did the tech deliver on its promise of authentic learning?
Well, what's fascinating here is the study found the platform's technical side had a huge impact on how authentic students felt the whole thing was. It was really foundational.
That totally makes sense. If the tool feels awkward or buggy, it pulls you right out of the experience. So what worked well technically? Any positives?
Yeah, there were definitely positives. Students liked the interactive part, the conceptual flow, as they called it, how it sort of mimicked a real clinical encounter, letting them ask probing questions.
Probing questions.
Exactly. One student put it really well. They said something like, it's more question-based, how we would actually be in clinical settings. You're doing the probing, which is a wonderful skill set to develop, versus being very passive. So that active part, that was definitely a plus for developing skills.
That sounds great for critical thinking. But I sense a but coming.
Yeah.
It wasn't all smooth sailing.
Not at all. That positive was often overshadowed by some pretty big technical limitations. A major one was the rigid phrasing needed for history taking. Students said they had to ask the same exact questions in many different ways just to get an answer the system understood.
Oh, that sounds incredibly frustrating.
It really was. Imagine the VP saying, I don't understand, or giving conflicting answers. Like one student mentioned, the patient may say yes on one aspect, but then when you ask a similar question in another way, it was a no. That kind of thing just breaks the realism completely.
Wow. So how do they cope with that frustration?
This is where it gets really interesting and a bit concerning. It led students to game the system.
Game the system. You mean like find workarounds?
Exactly.
Yep.
They'd literally write down the exact phrases the platform liked. Or they'd just ask questions they knew scored points, even if they wouldn't ask them in real life. One student basically admitted it, saying, I knew which questions I had to ask just to get the right score. It wasn't questions I necessarily would have asked. It was questions that I was like, okay, well, I know that this counts as a point, so I'm just going to keep asking this question.
Yikes. So it becomes about points, not patience. Not about learning clinical reasoning.
Precisely. It turns it into a task, a puzzle, not a simulation of care.
Okay, so going back to that authenticity idea, the physical versus the psychological, where did the students land on that? What mattered more to them?
The study was pretty clear on this. The physical stuff, the 3D look, the realistic wounds. Yeah, they noticed it, but they said it was minimally important for their actual learning.
Minimally important, okay.
What really mattered, and what was often missing, was that psychological authenticity, the feel of the interaction. Because it was lacking, students often described the VPs as robotic or felt like they were just playing a game.
Robotic, I can see that.
Yeah, and one student made a really powerful point about the lack of a visceral experience compared to dealing with real people. That emotional gut-level connection wasn't there, and they felt it actually hurt their memory and learning. So the feel was definitely more important than the look.
Okay, so the platform had its issues, definitely impacting that psychological authenticity. But what about the students themselves? Did everyone react the same way?
No, and that's another key layer. The study found basically two different camps among the learners, even using the same flawed platform.
Okay.
So some students were just highly self-motivated. They actually liked the freedom the VP platform gave them to kind of direct their own learning. One said something like, the program was ultimately beneficial because I am self-motivated. So by having a bit more freedom, I can access that material that is the highest yield for my learning. These students could sort of see past the glitches and find the value anyway.
That's interesting. So their internal drive helped them overcome the tech issues.
It just seems so.
Yeah.
But then you had the other group.
The ones who weren't as self-motivated.
Right. They felt less driven by purely self-directed stuff. They felt they weren't really being held accountable in the same way. And for them, those technical problems we talked about, they became huge barriers, way bigger than any potential benefit. They just felt frustrated, drained. One said, it took up more time than it should for what I got out of it. It felt like a waste of time.
Wow, quite a contrast. So they needed something more than just the virtual tool.
Yeah, they really miss the human element. They express a strong preference for like actual interaction, group discussions, things like that.
This makes me think about gamification. Adding game elements like points to learning. It's supposed to be motivating.
Right, it often is. But here it seems the scoring system might have maybe inadvertently shifted the focus for some students. Instead of learning for learning's sake, that intrinsic motivation, it became about getting the points, the score. That's extrinsic motivation.
Especially for those less self-directed students, maybe.
Exactly. It really highlights how crucial that internal drive, that intrinsic motivation can be for making these simulations work. It helps students, suspend disbelief, push past the imperfections. Without it, the flaws just seem much bigger and the whole thing can fall apart.
Okay, so we have the platform issues, the individual learner differences.
Mm-hmm.
What else shaped their experience? The study mentioned context, right?
Absolutely. You can't separate the learning experience from the bigger picture. The broader environment and their personal situations mattered a lot.
And the elephant in the room must have been the pandemic itself.
Oh, massively. Students were stressed. They felt they were missing out on vital, real-world clinical rotations. And that definitely colored how they viewed any kind of virtual learning that was supposed to replace it.
Yeah, I bet.
One student really captured that, saying, I think a lot of what I was feeling is probably altered because of where we were in time and the stress that I had and how I didn't want to do virtual because I was missing out. So it wasn't just about the iHuman platform in isolation. It was about everything else going on.
And personal lives too, right? Juggling assignments, maybe kids at home.
Yeah, exactly. Things like managing other coursework. Some students were even homeschooling their children during lockdowns. All that affects your bandwidth, your energy, your ability to engage fully with something like a VP. Learning doesn't happen in a bubble.
Definitely not. Was there anything else about how the VPs fit into the bigger picture of their education?
Yes. Another critical point was what the study called curricular positioning. Basically, when they used the VPs in their program, many students felt these tools would have been much more valuable earlier on.
Earlier,
Yeah.
as in before actual clinical rotations.
Yeah, like preparation tool to
Yeah.
build basic skills, maybe practice history taking before they saw real patients. But often, it seemed like the VPs were positioned later, more as a substitute for missed clinical time.
And that didn't sit well.
Not for many. They were hungry for that real-world experience, and the VP felt like a poor replacement at that stage. One student summed it up: "I think that the iHuman program can't really supplement any other part of the program. I didn't find as much value with the iHuman cases compared with everything else."
Hmm.
So there was this mismatch between what they needed or expected and what the VP was offering at that point in their training.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. So if we boil it all down, what are the really key takeaways from this deep dive for people designing these tools or using them in education?
Well, I think it highlights these really complex links, doesn't it?
Okay.
Between the technology itself, especially its impact on that psychological authenticity, how that interacts with the student's own motivation and approach to learning, and then how the whole thing lands depends on the wider context, the curriculum, the timing, even global events like a pandemic. But the absolute core message, psychological authenticity, seems paramount. It's the key driver for engagement and ultimately for learning. Get that wrong, and the rest doesn't matter as much.
That seems really clear. So what can educators and developers actually do with this knowledge? What are the practical implications?
The study gives some pretty concrete suggestions. First, obviously, prioritize that psychological realism, make the cases appropriately challenging, make sure the flow mimics real clinical thinking, and crucially, improve the conversational aspect. Maybe better AI, better chatbot tech could help there.
Make the interaction feel real.
Exactly. Second, be really clear about framing. These VPs should be supplements, tools to enhance learning, not presented as replacements for hands-on clinical experience. Manage expectations.
Good point. What else?
Consider putting them earlier in the curriculum. Use them as preparation, building foundational skills before students hit the wards.
Makes sense. Build confidence first.
And fourth, don't just rely on the VP alone. Combine it with other things. Maybe follow up a VP case with an in-person group discussion or a tutorial. That can boost engagement, provide accountability, especially for those students who aren't as naturally self-directed.
Blend the virtual with the real.
Right. And finally, maybe a broader point, but this highlights the need to foster self-directed learning skills in students much earlier on in their education journey.
Those are really solid takeaways. Now, the study did have limits, right?
Yeah.
Small sample, one platform.
Oh, for sure. You always have to acknowledge limitations. It was a small group, just 11 students from Canada, using just the iHuman platform, and of course, the huge shadow of the pandemic context. But even with those limits, the recommendations that come out of it, they feel pretty solid. They're likely, as the authors say, theoretically transferable to other virtual learning tools and situations in healthcare.
So, valuable insights regardless.
I think so, yes.
It leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? As this technology keeps getting better, potentially more immersive, how much more visceral, as that student put it, can these virtual experiences actually become? And what does that mean for the future? How do we best blend this amazing virtual potential with the invaluable reality of actual human connection in healthcare education? What do you think?